Hey everyone, welcome back. So in this session I just wanted to start by giving a really quick recap on where we're up to so far, and then I'm going to briefly talk about what we're going to be covering next. So in the last sessions and videos we basically have brought our beetle up to a more finalized, what I would call a high poly mesh usually, but this is now going to be we're going to turn this mesh from a high poly mesh where we've got lots of detail and topology and everything into a more game ready mesh. And in this case, we're going to be working to Unreal 5 and Nanite. So we're going to be working this mesh up so that it is going to work for Unreal 5. And to be honest, that's not going to mean that the mesh is going to be super low poly, because when we apply our mesh into Unreal 5, we can still keep a lot of the topology that we have here. But we are going to edit the topology and make it easier to work with for UVing and unwrapping, and then bringing into Substance for texturing. So that's what we're going to be covering next. Hey everyone, so in this session I just wanted to go over some details about Nanite, and then we'll move on to talking about texel density as well before we jump into our final game mesh. So I definitely would advise, if you want to understand more about Nanite and Unreal 5, jump over to the Unreal documentation. I've actually got this open here for the Nanite page, and this is going to give you lots of information. It's well worth reading through this. So you'll see some examples. You can download example projects that are using Nanite in Unreal as well. And you can just understand a little bit more about what a Nanite mesh is and how it relates. I'm not going to cover it in loads of detail here, but essentially now it means that we can bring higher res geometry into Unreal 5, and you can see a bunch of the information here. Also breaks down, it's got some comparisons of how Nanite actually works and some of the sort of debug views and things like that. Some tips and advice and how it handles the data. So here we can see actually the difference between just a regular low poly mesh, static mesh with 4K textures, and then this is what the Nanite mesh would look like. So you can see there's a lot more topology there. Basically the silhouette is definitely more kind of detailed and everything, and the mesh in general is more detailed. And then it breaks down in this section how the sizes work out and how this can be effectively, the Nanite mesh can end up being cheaper once you compress it. So there's a bunch of really helpful information in here, but essentially what it means for the props and for the modeling is that we can use a much higher polygon amount. So we're going to go through that as we jump into the actual mesh itself. But I wanted to also touch on texel density, so we'll just jump into that as well. So for texel density, this is basically a figure that we use when we're describing unwrapping, and when we are working with our models, we basically work towards a value, a texel density or a texture resolution for our models. So we're working for a game that can depend on different factors, and I would definitely highly recommend Leonardo's texel density guide. This is one of the most useful resources that I've found for texel density in general. It has loads of great information, and it talks about what the theory of texel density is. So just to briefly touch on this, and definitely support him. If you jump over to his Gumroad or ArtStation, you can download this guide in high resolution. It's well worth the cost there. So yeah, definitely would advise that. But just as an overview, texel density in general is trying to achieve a uniform resolution on our textures across a scene. So if we're working on an environment, we kind of want to avoid this type of result where we have different resolutions, because in real life this isn't something that you would experience, obviously. So we're trying to keep this uniform, and that definitely helps with immersion when you're working on a video game. And then the way you decide on the resolution that you'd want to use is usually based on a size. So we have, say, 1024 pixels per meter as an example, and you can calculate that based on the texel sizes and based on the size of your object. So that's usually how you do it, and you'll use a script or a plugin in your various 3D programs. So if you're using, say, Max or Maya or Blender or Modo or whatever, you would use a script to calculate that based on the scale. And then the size that you choose, whether or not it's, say, 1024 per meter or 512 per meter or so on and so forth, comes down to how the asset's going to be used, and also what type of genre of game you're making. So if you're making a third-person game, the camera is a lot further out, so you don't need to use as high a resolution. And then if we're looking at, say, a strategy game where the camera is really zoomed out, we can definitely get away with lower resolutions. And then for something like a first-person shooter game, you can zoom right in on the camera, so you can see a lot more detail. So a higher resolution is usually advisable. So that's the basics of texel density. It can get more complicated. So here we can see examples of depending on where the asset is used in the scene, if it's closer to the player or further away, and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of really good information in this guide. I would definitely suggest reading that. The other one I also found very helpful is this is a free guide. If you go to Beyond Extent, there's a guide here which I would definitely recommend as well. This one just explains a lot about what texel density is and then how to use it in the same kind of way, and we can see different examples as well. One of the things I like about this is it relates it to how you would be viewing it as far as a screen is concerned, and how do you actually choose the texel density. So we're going to talk about this as well in relation to the project that we're working on today. So one of the ways to calculate it, as I mentioned, is using a size based on the scale of the object. So you can actually choose the object size and get a value, a texel density value for that, right? And here you can see same thing as well. If we're using Blender, we can use different texel density checkers for that. And then we can also have different workflows depending on what we're going through. So there's loads of information in this guide. I would definitely be worth reading through this and just getting some of this information. And you can see some other resources as well, which were inspired by this article. So I wanted to just jump back to this area here where we're talking about ways to calculate texel density. So it talks about two different ways, and one of them is to calculate by the size, as I mentioned, but the other way is to calculate by the screen size. So how big is the asset on the screen, right? And so for my particular project, I wasn't planning on having this as an actual game mesh in terms of it being in a video game. It's mostly just a personal project for working with sort of having screenshots and putting on your portfolio. So it's not going to be in a video game an object you interact with and sort of go up to in a game, right? So that's not the intention of this particular project. The intention is that it would just be nice renders. So in that case, I'm basing my texel density much more on screen size and how big it's going to be in the screen. So for the final screenshots, I know that I'm going to render my beetle almost completely in the screen. So based on the size of the screen, I would determine what the texel density would be. So if we're looking at, say, a 1080p screenshot, for example, which is what this is, 1920 by 1080, then we don't need to get any bigger than 2000 pixels across, right? So if we were to jump back to the beetle, that means that from sort of the front here to the front here, we're not going to benefit from having anything sort of larger than a 2000 pixel texture, right? That's if we were using a sort of 1080p screenshot here. So that's something that you would want to consider. And then if you're working, say, to 4K resolution, that would just be double. So we wouldn't want, if it's 4000 pixels by 2000 pixels roughly, then we would want to make sure that we have enough texel density across that screen. Obviously, if we're going to zoom in on the beetle, like if we were going to zoom right into really close and fill the whole screen with something like this, then that detail isn't going to hold up super well. So we'd need an even larger texel density, or to sort of break that up into more textures, right? So just for the sake of ease and making this as simple as possible, the way that I broke this down was I basically had a texture for each main kind of component element. So we'll just sort of draw over that. So for the head, I had a texture for the head, and then I had a texture for the body, because these easily break up into different pieces, and then I would have a texture here for the legs as well. So that's basically the way that I broke it down as far as this particular asset is concerned. One of the benefits as well of breaking it down, say, into different components, like the legs as a separate texture, means that we could have a duplicate texture if we wanted to add variation. So if we wanted say this particular leg to be different from this leg, we could duplicate the texture set and do that. In this case, I didn't need to, but you can definitely do that as well. So that's pretty beneficial if that's something that you wanted to do. So yeah, the other reason I didn't base this in terms of size is because the beetle is very small. So if I was to use a size-based texel density for this particular object, like if this was in a game, then he would be pretty low resolution, because let's say you had a person in here, then let's say we just add in like the size of an actual human here. So, and I remember as well that I scaled up this beetle a lot. I scaled him up by ×8. So this is the size of a person at the moment. This beetle is really big, right? But if he was scaled back to his original size, then he's going to be tiny in comparison to a person. So if you were playing in a first-person shooter and you saw this beetle on the ground, you're not going to need a really high-resolution texture for that. So it's a little bit of a different situation, though, because in this case, I'm obviously just working for this as a personal project and wanting to get nice screenshots. I'm not worrying so much about the size of this object in a game. So I would approach it differently if I was working towards a game. Okay, so now we have our beetle high-res mesh sort of figured out here. The next step is to basically turn this into a more finalized nanite game-ready mesh. So that's going to be our next steps as far as the tutorial are concerned. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some techniques of how I actually optimize down the geometry, because the moment you can see this is really, really dense. There's a lot of smoothing happening with turbo smooths and things like that. And although we want this to look really nice and detailed, we definitely don't need it to be as high poly as what we have here. We can cut down on some of the geometry. So the way I'm going to generally work with this is we're going to come back into our working files that we have. So using the leg again as the sort of main example, because there's a lot of the challenges that we have in the legs are also going to be present in all the other parts. So once we learn how to do it with the legs, we can easily do the body and the other parts. It's exactly the same workflow and technique. So one thing to note before we jump in is that I have actually separated out the feet a little bit, so you can see that these guys here, if we sort of come through, so we've got our different like foot pieces and everything here. So this is where we left the high poly before. We have our feet with kind of more detail and everything here, the different pieces. So what I've done is I've made a foot which is created from collection instances. So each one of these is a separate section. So if we then jump back over into these pieces, these are the individual feet sections. So if we kind of come through here, you can see we've got the first part of the foot, we've got the second part of the foot, the third part, and then we've got this section is actually part of the toe, and then we have this other claw section. So when you bring all of that together, you've essentially got each one of these pieces. These sections here, the intention with this was to have this kind of working in the sense that we could rotate it and everything. Let me just bring up the gizmo 1 second. All right, the gizmo wasn't showing because I have transforms locked. So if I jump over to rotate, you can see this here. So this is kind of set up so that I can actually test the animation, and that's something that is definitely helpful. Is sort of coming in here we showed before is locking the rotations and locations and things, so you can actually test the movement and see how this is going to interact and work. So you can see here that we can rotate these individual pieces and actually test our animation, or how these are actually going to move and articulate. So these sections here, this is the toe, so we can just rotate our toes this way, and then we can also rotate the claw as well. So it gives us a lot of movement and everything. So that's how this is now set up. I just wanted to recap that because I slightly changed how these guys are working, but it's using the same process as before, where we use the instances, the collection instances, to sort of bring that in, and then I've just parented everything together so that you can move each one of these kind of individually, and everything, nothing moves except this one. These guys are all just rotating, right? So that's kind of how the foot piece is working. So then we now want to jump into how do we actually optimize down some of this geometry, and some of it's going to be easier than other parts, especially if we've not done any kind of quad remesh. Like in these cases, a lot of this is quad remesh for preview, so we're going to have to rework some of these, but we'll sort of go through that process. The other thing I would like to do as well is set up a little bit of a folder structure again, as we did before in the other parts, so we can actually work on our low poly pieces and start to see them together. So to do that, I would you can create new folders wherever you want in terms of the structure and everything. I'm probably just going to create a new one, which is basically just going to be our low poly or nanite mesh, whatever you want to call it. We'll call it low poly. That's probably going to be fine. And then what I want to do here is I want to create one for the legs. And I'm going to basically put all of my pieces from these collection instances into here. So we'll just add those in. So we'll start with the femur. I like to basically, in this case, what I'm trying to achieve is I just want to add in a bunch of these individual leg pieces, and then we're going to effectively move them and kind of offset them from each other so that when we actually bake these later in Substance, that they're not going to interact with each other. So we can just visually see them all, but we're not going to have any issues. So next we'll choose, I want to go through and actually add the individual pieces of the feet. So we'll come through here and just do that. So this just means we can visually see each one of these, and it might be easier to duplicate them and just add each foot in this way. So as we optimize these, we'll actually start to see how these are looking. So let's grab the claw, and then we'll just add the toe in as well. Oops, just duplicate that. Okay, so that is all. This is now basically all the pieces that we have of the leg, right? Those are all the sections that we need. And then as we work on these collections, we are actually going to have this stuff update, right? So that's the kind of aim there. The other thing I would also say is that when I worked on this, I duplicated the high poly so that I had a backup. The other alternative you can also do is just save another version, like an iterative version of the Blender file. That's something that I would definitely suggest, so that you have a backup as you work here. But I want to edit this geometry we have here is the geometry I want for the final mesh. So I want it to update here, and then I also want it to update on the final model of the beetle as well. So it's easier for me to just do that directly in these particular models here. So if you are going to do that, just remember that it's going to be destructive. So sometimes it's good to just have a backup for that stuff. So using the femur as an example here, I'm going to show some of the ways that I would actually optimize this geometry and then get it ready for unwrapping. So we're focusing, we'll cover unwrapping as the second part of this, but I just want to show how I'm going to optimize this geometry. So at the moment you can see that this is something like 300,000 triangles, which is a lot for just one section of the model. So we don't need it to be anywhere near as dense as that. And you can see that this is kind of broken down into different pieces. A lot of the ones that say retopo here are when we've run the quad remesher. So if we were to remove those, we're left with these pieces, which are where they've actually been modeled a little bit more by hand. So if you're approaching one that's been modeled by hand, this is usually pretty straightforward. You would usually come in and see what the modifiers are doing as far as what we've got in here. So you can see that I do add bevels and booleans. So we'll kind of go through each one of these and how we could optimize this. So usually if I've got a bevel and it's not, if it had lots and lots of sides, like it was say 20-sided, we probably wouldn't need it to be as dense as that. So usually I'll pick something that you don't want it to look too polygonal. You want it to be pretty smooth in general. So kind of check the silhouette and things like that. And use reasonable amounts because we need to unwrap this. So we don't want it to be super dense and hard to work with. So it's kind of what we're doing here. And then as you can see, we go through this process. We've got these different booleans. So usually the stuff that is the booleans and things like that, I would usually try and collapse down a lot of this stuff. So we can go through that in a second, and I'll usually find a place where I want to collapse down. So generally what I tend to do with stuff like this is I'll collapse down where the geometry is easily workable. And then if we've got something like a bevel that's beveling all the edges like this, that becomes a lot harder to work with. So I leave that as a non-destructive. I don't collapse that down, basically. So in this case, we would just come through and collapse all the elements, which now leaves us with this kind of base geometry for the object, right? And from this, we can now just clear all the edges. So I have a shortcut in HardOps for that, which we can just do here. So if we just do clear sharps, that's going to remove, let's do that again. So just undo this. So if you do clear sharps, it defaults to remove the modifier. So we'll just turn that off. And then we can just do a shade smooth. So now we have no hard edges or anything in the model. And then usually what I'll do is I'll just come through, and if there's any sort of geometry that needs cleaning up, I'll just come through and remove that. So there's a couple of edges here. At the moment, for something like this as well, I'm not worried about there being lots of n-gons. You can see that these are like crazy n-gons and things like that. I'm not worried about that right this moment. I just want to get everything as clean as possible. And then usually I'll just go through and see if I can tidy up any verts or edges that aren't really looking that great. So in here, we're just kind of connecting these up. And then we can just, add in some extra edges to just tidy up what we can see here. And then usually for something like this, you can also add a triangulate modifier. So if we do that, you'll see this is what the actual object is looking like when you add the triangulate on. And you can sort of look at the details here and how this is coming together. So some of this you can actually kind of clean up yourself. So you can see here we could just kind of connect these up. And where it makes sense, I would just add in edges to kind of connect stuff up. And something that along the lines of this kind of stuff. And we can just sort of come through and do a pass on that. Just try and add geometry that sort of makes sense to close up some of those n-gons. And then as you're working, try not to sort of repeat the same process over and over again. You can see that this model is symmetried, so we can just mirror that, and you can see that we can update a lot of those edges, and then I'll collapse down the mirror. So you can see that that's already looking a lot better. Generally, when you're working with stuff, you want to avoid really long, thin triangles like you can see in these scenarios here. Like most of this stuff is pretty good. A lot of this is fine. But here we have these really long, thin triangles, which are not ideal. So we could then add like a couple of edges in there just to help that so that there's not as many long, thin edges. So we could just put a couple of edges in here to do that. And then as we add the triangulate now, you can see that that's definitely just a little bit cleaner. So that's going to look a bit better, I think, in terms of our topology. So this is already looking much nicer. If we turn back on the other parts of this model, what you'll notice is that we've got a big kind of hole in the model, and we have this big section in here, and we don't need some of the faces that we can see on the back of this model. So one of the things we can do here is we could delete these back faces, and then we could take this stuff kind of forward a little bit more. So just sliding the edges until we get to a reasonable place there. You can kind of see how that's working. So you're never going to see in there. So as long as this is looking decent from sort of most angles, that's what you want to check. You want to make sure that you can't see any back faces and things like that, but that's generally the process there. So as far as kind of cleaning that mesh up, you can sort of see that there. We do have a couple of issues with the way that the bevel modifier is working at the moment. So you can see that it's doing this weird kind of thing there. So what I would do in the bevel modifier is come down to where it says geometry and just turn off loop slide. That's going to keep that really nice and clean. And then for a small bevel like this, you probably don't need to have 6 divisions. So I would maybe go for between something like 4 to 2 bevel, depending on the size of it. If you need this to smooth a bit nicer, then you can obviously add a weighted normals to that. Or alternatively, you can turn on the hardened normals in the bevel, which will give you pretty nice smoothing. So you can see sort of how that looks. And it's all going to depend on the scale of this actually in the model, right? So we're not going to see super close up to this. So maybe we don't need 4 on our bevel. We could probably get away with 3 or 2. And that's probably going to look just fine for our model. And it's going to be nice and easy to work with because the topology of this isn't too crazy. So we're only looking at 4,000 triangles for this particular object at the moment, right? So this is definitely a lot easier to work with than what we had before. And then we have our weighted normals if we wanted to add that, and our triangulate. just collapse the mirror down, and the triangulate will kind of keep all of the geometry nice and clean. So if we export that into a game mesh or for baking, we can add the triangulate to this. So that's going to look pretty good. And then let's now kind of cover another example here. So that covers like how we would optimize and try and sort this out. If you've got these guys, it would probably be a good idea to maybe snap these. Let's just try and move that there. So that should be good. So yeah, you can just kind of straighten out the edges and things here. So that's a way that you might optimize something like that. For these pieces, these are even easier because the topology of this is already pretty good. So in this case, you could maybe remove a couple of the edge loops out of this if you wanted to. It's not like a huge issue, but yeah, maybe just remove a couple of edge loops out of that. You can see sort of the detail that we have. And then for this one, again, we've got the bevel modifier, so we can come in and choose like how many bevels we're going to use on this. Maybe 4 is fine. And then this has weighted normals as well. And then we can always add triangulate to this one. This one isn't going to need triangulate apart from on the capped edges there. So if you wanted to add that in there, you can definitely do that. You can see how that's going to fix up our center circle there. And then on this one, same kind of story, you can just go through. So that process is really straightforward for stuff where you've modeled the topology really nicely. Like if you've modeled something yourself, it's going to be pretty easy to come through the modifiers and just and enable and disable stuff. So here, if I've got this object, you can see it has a Boolean applied. So usually what I'd be looking for here is collapsing everything apart from the last bevel. So if we're looking at this, you can see that we have our Boolean, we have our bevel applied. This actually does have subdivision, so we can choose if we want to add subdivision or not, which we can go over in a second. But I would collapse down the Boolean. So when I do that, I get this this message saying, do you want to make this a single object? It's basically because it's an instance. So the reason for that is because in some of my other pieces, I reuse that same section, right? I use it again in some of the feet and things like that. You can see this sort of sphere is on the end of this object. So it's the same object, right? So in this case, I wanted to basically unwrap this object once and then just reuse it. So what I would do in this case is basically make a folder under here and just call it instance. And then I can just move anything that I want to be an instance into that folder. So I know that it's an instance and not to include it when I do my baking and unwrapping, right? So that's just a bit of advice there, but we could collapse down this Boolean here, and then yeah, for optimizing this particular one, you can see that we have the subdivision as well. So I would probably just select everything and remove the mirrored part of this, and then this bevel is fine. For subdivision, you can definitely add subdivision in there, but you're going to see that it's going to add a huge amount of topology to this, which in this case isn't going to make the object really that much smoother. In a lot of cases, it's not the most optimal way to basically make things nice and smooth in this case. So what you could do is either use a lower subdivision amount, which is going to bring the topology down a lot, or in the case of this, what I did, because it made it a lot easier to work with, was basically add extra divisions into parts where I want it to be smoother, and then use my set flow to basically smooth this out. Sometimes the set flow will do weird things like this, so you have to kind of scale them a bit manually. But you can see here that that can be a much better way to smooth out that silhouette and shape. In some cases, you just don't need that subdivision, right? So as we add the subdivision, it's going to smooth things, but in this case, you can't really tell much of a difference, and it's a lot higher topology for not a lot of gain. So in a lot of cases, I would just add in that subdivision myself manually and try to clean up the topology, because I'm mostly focusing on how easy this is to work with when it comes to unwrapping and that kind of stuff. So we just don't need all of these edges sometimes when you're working with this mesh. You can still have it feel very smooth and interesting without having loads of topology being added. So you can sort of see that this is still looking very nice, even though it's not that much different when we add this subdivision. And again, it's all about scale and context, right? So when you sort of see this on the size, you're going to see it. It's not going to be super detailed. So yeah, that covers like the basic process for things that are already modeled, like when you've got something that's in a pretty good spot like this, and it's just a case of removing a couple of modifiers and cleaning up the geometry and everything. One thing I do want to cover though is a scenario like this where we have an edge on the inside, but some of it is kind of covered. So my tip for that is basically just applying a bit of an inset in here so that you get to a stage where you basically have a piece of the geometry that you're not going to see, you can remove, because you don't want to UV that and waste UV space in there, but you still want a nice kind of rounded edge on this particular area. So that's an advice I'd give for things like that. When you have a central piece kind of in there that you can't see, is basically try to remove any geometry that isn't going to be seen. And you can do that by just insetting there. Okay, so now we've shown how to optimize some of the geometry where we've worked just with mostly modeling techniques such as booleans and things like that. I want to show where we've actually used something like the quad remesher to get more remesh topology, and how we're actually going to work with this type of information, right? So sometimes this can be pretty good as its own topology. You can see that if we look at this though, the quad remesher does have errors in some places. So if you wanted to get clean topology, you'd need to kind of come in and clean up some of these issues, or go back to the original mesh that you used to generate this and try and regenerate it. So there's kind of two ways to approach this. So let's turn these guys off and we'll just have a look at one of the examples. So that's why I kept all of this stuff as reference and as backups, so that we can actually work with this stuff here. So we'll just turn on some of these modifiers here. You can see that we have this piece. So I'm going to take this section here, and you can see how this is actually looking, right? So for something like this, you can see the topology of this is around 5,000 triangles. One approach is that we could collapse this down and then come in and manually clean up our topology, right? That's definitely could be a good approach depending on what it is. In this case, this is very organic, so we're probably not going to save a huge amount of topology by doing that. So in this case, we could actually come in with the quad remesher and try and use that topology as our final topology for the model. So let's kind of get back to where that is. And so with that, you just basically want to come in here and turn on these different options and experiment with the topology you're going to get from remeshing this. So if we remesh this now, we need to make sure that we don't have our symmetry enabled, and we run our remesh. And so you can see that that does create some pretty clean topology. And in the case of this as well, we're not going to need a lot of this underside geometry as well. So this could actually be a pretty good mesh. You can see that it's around 9,000. We could experiment with lower as well if we wanted to try to get to closer to our topology from before. So let's kind of go from to say 3,000. And you can see this is what we get. And then sometimes you can notice like you have errors. So in this case, this one wouldn't be too difficult to kind of manually clean up there. So yeah, and again, sort of here as well, you can see there's a little error on the edges there. So as you get lower, you start to run into some slight errors on the edges. There are also things you can kind of clean up in here as well. So if we were to work with this particular mesh, we've got, say, edges in here that we definitely don't need. So we can remove that. Same for this, like we're not going to ever see into here, so we can just basically clean up a lot of this, just selecting all of these particular sections here and just basically removing that. So I'm just going to select all of that, and you can just remove these parts, and then it would be the same here. So I found it pretty helpful when I was doing stuff like this to basically just come in here and select with seams. So if I go into here, and then I can just basically draw around the edges here. And the reason I'm keeping like a buffer, I'll show you that in a second if I come through here. So we can just select all of this and then just mark that, and then do a selection and select by seam. So we just missed one there. Let's do that. And if we select by seam, this is going to select this island. We can remove it. And so now you can see that this is pretty low topology. There's a couple of bits like that we would potentially want to kind of clean up in here, but you can sort of see that we've got something that would be usable as like a final geometry there. The reason we keep that that buffer is because if we wanted to apply, say, a bevel modifier to this, then we can keep this nice edge. So if we were to increase the bevel size of this a little bit, let's kind of punch that in. Whoops, I meant to do it on this one. Okay. So yeah, so now you can see that this keeps that nice seam that we have in there, like the panel line seam, by adding that bevel in there. So that's why we keep the geometry kind of underneath. If we didn't have this, so if we select like a bunch of this stuff and just remove it, you'll see that we don't get that nice bevel on there anymore. So you don't get a nice transitional seam there. So that's one of the reasons why we're keeping that geometry in the inside there. And it just allows us to have a nice seam there. So this is one way to work with the quad remesh topology. Another way, and we'll go for this particular example because this is an example where I didn't rely on the quad remesh topology there. So if we hide this guy and turn on some of our retopoed areas, you can see that I have done a quad remeshed version of this. So that's what that kind of looks like, right? So if we just were to actually work with the original topology, what you'll see here is that these are a lot more hard edge shapes. So we don't need to worry so much about, we've got flatter sections of the model, so we can definitely do this cheaper in its original topology. So for this, I would basically just come in and clean this up. So it's the same process as before. We choose like the different details, and you can see here that as we kind of smooth out a lot of these areas, we have modifiers that we're using where there's a lot of topology, like the bevel, for example, has 7 sides. We could say optimize that down. This cutter that's in here has a bevel with a lot of sides on it, so again, we can just come in and reduce the amount of sides, which is going to save us time when it comes to optimizing, right? So we can come through here and just check all of these, and then we've got this other one. So we would come into this guy and basically reduce the amount of bevels here, and then that would be starting to look pretty good. It's not looking too bad. And then we have this cut in here. So that's now maybe some topology that we could actually work with. So we can remove this subdivision and just apply all the modifiers. And in this case, you can actually keep the backup, right? So if you wanted to just duplicate this and pull this in here as our final topology, then we can turn off our references and collapse this down and keep that geometry. So in this case, what I would probably do here is where we have got our quad remeshed version of this, we can just delete that. And the same for this guy as well, where we've got our quad remeshed version, we can just remove that. And this is now going to be the final topology we actually have for our model, right? And the same for this guy. This is going to require a lot of cleanup. So what you can see here is there's just like a lot of issues in general with lots of kind of vertices and things like that where it's not super clean. So there's a few ways to kind of tackle that. Firstly, what I would do is just remove all of the sharp angles and edges. So you can sort of see that that just keeps everything nice and smooth. And then what I would do in places like this is usually, there's a couple of tools you can use, like the Mesh Machine's Boolean cleanup can be really great for this. So if you run this, you can basically use it to kind of weld up all the verts that you have from a Boolean. So that can definitely be a good way to optimize geometry that you can see there. So that's like a really quick way to get rid of things like this. You basically just run the Boolean cleanup. Sometimes this will fail, but it is a really nice tool that can basically save you a lot of time. So especially when you've got stuff like this going on where it's just a mess of vertices where the Booleans have kind of interacted, and you just want to really quickly clean that up. And you can see at the moment it's kind of welding these guys to this geometry. If you want it to be the other way around, you just do a mouse wheel and it will basically do it the opposite way, which can keep, I want to keep the silhouette of the rounding of this. So that's what I'm doing there. You can see that we optimize that geometry really quickly. And then you can always just go with the manual approach as well, right? Just kind of manually coming in here and welding up verts or connecting them. And remember the tip I showed before is don't do this work twice. You can see that this is mirrored. So we just add a mirror modifier to that. And then for something like this as well, we'd want to add a bevel. So if we add the bevel, you'll start to see where the bevel is working pretty well. And then in places where it's not, that usually means that we're looking at an area where there's some vertices that we need to kind of come in and clean up. So you can see here that this is a section where we'd want to come in and weld those. And then we've got a much more bevel that's actually working. So you can turn our loop slide back off and you can start to see here. So in this one, this is mostly to do with some of the edges, plus also it's to do with the angle as well. So another thing you can also do if you've got verts that are very close to each other is just do a merge by distance, which will sometimes fix up any really small verts. And you can see this is definitely getting into a much nicer kind of look here. And yeah, we can see here that we just want to sort of shift some of our verts to get some smoothing. So if you see the bevel kind of overshoot like this, you can just move your edges and things a little bit, and that's going to clean that up. So yeah, so you can start to see kind of how that's working. You probably wouldn't even want a bevel that's as large as this. So if you're going for say 0.3, you can see that we're getting pretty clean topology now on this particular object. And this has obviously been worked up from a Boolean mesh here. So you can sort of see how that's looking. It's definitely getting into a much better place. So that is my workflow if I'm working with something where I've quad remeshed it. Usually I have the backup of the topology. Some things are going to be harder to clean up than others. So like as an example, this particular section is going to be really easy to clean up, right? Because it's not complicated. We can come back into our references here, find that piece, and you can see that that's not going to be a hard thing to tidy up at all. So it's going to be pretty easy. So it depends on the piece and the complexity of what you've got going on in there. But yeah, definitely having those reference assets that you worked with before you run the quad remesher is really good, because we can always come back to those and we can work them back up again. So that's kind of the aim, and we just want everything to feel like it has a relatively even quad flow, and we're probably aiming for things to not be super dense, and generally we want to try to make sure that things smooth nicely at this stage, because this is going to be our final mesh. And we're also not going to be using a high to low poly bake. We're not going to be using normal maps to bake in the geometry. We're mostly just going to be relying on the geometry itself. So that's definitely something that you want to consider. And then the other thing as well is, so in this case, you can see that we have an issue with the bevel because this is angle based. So in this case, if I wanted to maybe be a bit more selective about where I put my bevels, then I would come into here and we can select this by sharpen. I would basically set a bevel weight. So we've put that bevel weight on these edges here, and you can just kind of come in same way that we've done before. You can come into this guy and just select bevel weight and then mark that as a bevel, right? And then under this one, we can just set this as a weighted bevel. So now what that will do is it will bevel based on that selection. So you can see that we can create nice smoothing. As you can see here, there's a little bit of cleanup to do. But if you get that sort of all cleaned up, and then you can mark out your bevels where you want that to be, you can start to get that more smoothing out how it should be intended to be smoothed, right? So that's kind of how we would approach the different portions that we've worked on, and when we've been modeling from the high poly, how we're going to optimize our geometry. So that shows some of those techniques of how we can clean up our existing geometry and prep it in readiness for unwrapping. Hey everyone, so skipping ahead a little bit here, we now have our finished model which we've actually optimized down for our Nanite in-game mesh and geometry here. This is just for the femur part of the leg here. So you can see that I've gone through and done a pass on all the different pieces. There's just over 10 pieces here for that particular section. We've all kind of split out into different areas. So what I wanted to do here is just briefly explain the next steps of the process, and then we'll jump in with some techniques about how I actually unwrap stuff. So what do I mean by unwrapping? Once we've got our model actually modeled out and we have some geometry that we're going to use as our in-game mesh, we have to go through a process called UV unwrapping. And so to briefly just explain what that is, I've got this image that shows it really well here, is that essentially what we do is we take the 3D geometry and we apply almost like a UV net to it, which is where we have this kind of flattened version of the mesh and we apply our texture to it. So this is a good demonstration of that. And the way that we usually do that is by using different UV techniques and by using seams. So we add seams to our model and then we unwrap. So just to show that kind of process and some of the tools that we have available, I'm going to use some of these basic primitive objects. So the first thing you would do is you would jump into the tab that says the UV editing. By default, this will bring you into a split view, and you'll have the UV editor on the left hand side. So it'll look something along the lines of this. And when we tab into edit mode, you won't see anything in the UV window to begin with until you start to select things, and then you'll start to see your UVs appearing here on the left. So to make things easier, we'll also apply a checker to this. So a texture like we saw in our example here, this is a checker texture for working with our UVs. So we'll apply one of those, and you can do that in different ways. If you've got various free add-ons, you'll sometimes see that you can assign checker materials. So in this Texel density checker, you can see that, or also sometimes in paid add-ons as well. So in this one, we have a Zen UV, we can apply our checker to that, and you'll see that we now have a checker material. I'll run over some of the add-ons that I use for UVing after I've shown some of the basic tools that come with Blender and some of the workflows that I tend to use. So here, like most objects, as you add them in, will have UVs. So you can see here that we have UVs on most of these objects. As we actually have added them, we'll assign the same materials to all of these objects here, so we can see the same material here, same checker. So the process really for unwrapping is you're going to tab into edit mode here, and you can see our UVs on the left hand side. You will bring up the unwrapping menu, and we have a bunch of tools that exist as part of UV mapping. So the first one is just your basic unwrap, and this is going to unwrap things based on seams. And then we have a couple of other options. Most of the time when I'm working, I tend to use just the regular unwrap option here, but I'll briefly run over some of these. Some of them will be more obvious. So a cube projection will basically just unwrap each face individually as if it's been unwrapped by a cube. We've got a cylindrical one, which will be great for using cylinders, and a sphere one, which would also be great from using spheres. The project from view will basically unwrap determined by the view that you're actually facing in the 3D view. So if we did this, you'll see that it will unwrap based on the view angle, right? And then we have a couple of other ones here. So Smart UV Project is just going to essentially do it based on the angle. So we can set an angle and then hit OK, and it's going to unwrap based on those angles. So it's automatically doing UV seams. And then Follow Active Quad is useful for doing a strip of poly. So if you had, say, a bunch of faces that you'd selected sort of around a shape like this, you could do Follow Active Quad, and it will straighten out all the UVs. So you have everything in a big long line, right? So that's some of the basic tools that come with Blender, and most 3D packages will have these types of tools as well. So similar kind of things like the cube projection and the sphere and everything, a lot of UV editors will have that. For Blender as well, you also have in the UV window, you have your end panel and your tools panel, just like you do in the 3D view. And so for these, mostly on the right hand side for the end panel, this is going to be add-ons and scripts, or it might also just be the basic controls that you have inside of Blender as well. So the view modes, the tool and the image, but there are a bunch of add-ons that are in this window enabled as well. So that's what that area is for. And then on the left hand side is your tool. So you've got your translate, basic tools like moving around and scaling and rotating your UVs. You have your regular annotate. You can rip the individual faces. So this guy will basically just allow you to pull UVs apart like this. And then we've got these kind of more sculpting style brushes. So you have a grab brush, which you can use to move things around, and a smooth and relax and everything here as well. So we've got a couple of different options. The controls for those come under the option for tool. So this one is the pinch tool and this one is the relax tool. So you can see here, and then we have our settings for those on the right hand side. So those are some of our basic tools. You can also get more options by looking at these menus and windows as well. So there's more UV options. We won't go into every single one of these, but yeah, so that's that's some of the basic options. And when we're unwrapping these basic shapes, my usual process for unwrapping is to give objects seams, and you can do those in a couple of different ways. One is to just mark the object like we did with hard ops before. So we could come in here and say, let's add in seams, and we'll just do a sharpen. And now you can see that we have a bunch of red seams. So when I press select all the objects and press U to unwrap, it's going to individually unwrap each one of these faces based off of those seams that we have there. So you can see how this is kind of connecting, and you can see the seams and everything. So that's our first way. That's my usual way of unwrapping. The other option is you can select all these faces here, or all the edges, and just do a clear seams here. So we've got clear seam, and to mark a seam, you can just select an edge and right click and mark seam. You can do that from the right click edge menu, and you can also do that from the unwrap menu as well. So you can do mark seam. So if we look at, say, this cylinder, for example, and we'll just clear all of the sharp angles and the seams and everything here. I'll just run a clear sharps. This is through hard ops. This is generally pretty useful for clearing all the angles. And we just do an unwrap here. So that should be looking good. So usually I'll just, with most objects, I'll just run a sharpen and add the seams in this way, and then we can just unwrap. And you'll notice that if I do that, we'll get weird distortion on things like cylinders. So notice that we have this weird result. So in this case, we could select an edge and just do a mark seam, and we'll just unwrap this again. And now you can see that we can get our UVs sort of straightened along edges and things like that, right? So that would be a good way to unwrap a cylinder. For cubes, I would just basically do individual, every single face is unwrapped along the lines of this. So anytime there's a sharp edge or a hard angle like this, you're going to want to add a seam on that hard angle. Here we have a cube with a bevel, so I just wanted to show that you can unwrap this guy in the same way, and then with a modifier over the top of this, this will still keep your UV seams with pretty minimal distortion on edges depending on the size of the bevel. Obviously, if we've got really large bevels, then you may see some issues there, but for the most part, this is going to keep a pretty good result with UVs for this particular type of object, even when we have a modifier that's being added on top. So I just wanted to demonstrate that as well. And then for cylinders, the default UVs come something along the lines of this for a cylinder, which is pretty good, but you get some distortion at the top. So you can add in seams manually for this. So if we wanted to add a seam, say, in the center of the sphere and unwrap that, you'd get a result something like this, where you get slightly less distortion on the top, but you'd have a big seam in the middle. So that's one way to kind of unwrap a cylinder there. You could also draw a seam from the bottom to the top just on one side of the object. So if we do a mark seam there, we can just unwrap that, and you'll see that that's how this is going to look. Gives you your UVs. You're going to get some distortion with that, but you can start to see how that one looks. So those are some different ways and approaches to unwrap, and some of the basics behind unwrapping. So next I'm going to go through some of the add-ons that I typically use, and then I'll actually jump into my particular workflow, and I'll show an example with the leg, with the femur, how I actually approach the unwrapping for that. Okay, so just to briefly run over some UV add-ons that I tend to use. So some of these are paid, some of them are free. So the first one is the Texel Density Checker. For the Texel Density Checker, this is a free add-on, and essentially what you can do here is choose the texture size you plan to use and then assign a Texel Density value to your object. So that one is a free one, plus it has also the checker materials in there as well. So there's a couple of good controls for that one. Usually find that here in the end panel on the right hand side of the 3D view, and some of these also appear on the right hand side of the UV editor as well. So you just have to check which area they're available in. Stuff like Zen UV, for example, is actually available in both. You can see that there. So it just depends on the add-on specifically there. The next one I tend to use, so there's a couple, I'll go through the free ones first. We have Text Tools. This is another free one. It just has a bunch of different tools that you can set. So you can do checker maps and things here. It has some UV layout options, so you can straighten your UVs and do different types of things here. And then we've got some options for baking, options for applying color IDs, and creating mesh textures. To be honest, I don't tend to really use this all that often. I used to have it installed for when I used to use 3ds Max, but it's not something that I tend to use all that much now. So yeah, in terms of another free one, we also have UV Toolkit. This is again a bunch of really useful tools, and you can see you have checker maps again built into this one. We've got different display options. We can arrange our UV islands, so this is about orientation and everything and aligning them and things like that. It does have some useful tools, like we can straighten our UVs as well. So if we had a bunch of faces that we wanted to unwrap and then straighten, so if we can just unwrap these guys, and then we could clear all the seams on this. So let's just do that. And then we'll select these guys and do an unwrap. So let's say we had something like this. We can do a seam again for this area. And then this is going to straighten by default. So if we just kind of offset our UVs a bit, when you hit straighten, this is just going to straighten out your UVs. So that's a pretty useful tool as well. So a few different options. We can obviously move between different UV spaces as well. It's got a bunch of really nice controls. So this one is another free one, which is pretty great. As far as paid ones, I don't tend to use that many. I only really tend to use ZenUV, which is a paid for add-on in terms of UVing. This has a bunch of really nice options in there as well. It's got texel density options, checker map stuff as well. It's got trim sheets. It's got different UV tools. There's a bunch of really helpful ones. I'm not really going to be using this in the tutorial though, so just to let you know on that one. And then the one that I do tend to use very frequently is UV Pack Master. So we'll get into this once we get into our packing section of the tutorial. So for packing, we essentially unwrap our UVs and then we need to move them into the UV space, which is this area we see where the texture is. So when we apply, when we have lots of UV islands, this is basically going to find an optimal solution for packing all of those. So just to briefly kind of show that, we had a bunch of UVs here and we chose to pack them. It's going to try and find the best solution for packing there. So that's another really useful one. I tend to use this a fair amount. I don't pack my UVs manually. I mostly just rely on add-ons to do that. And this will just try and find the best solution over time, and it has a bunch of different options. So that's, again, a really good tool just for using UV. So definitely recommend this one as well. So now we've explained UVing in a little bit more detail and showed some examples and the add-ons I tend to use. I want to start by actually showing the process I would typically take for unwrapping an object. So here we have the femur that we worked on earlier, and I'm basically going to go through each one of these areas and just start to unwrap stuff. So the first step is applying a base material to everything. So I have the low underscore leg for this particular object assigned to all of these individual pieces. And so in this case, the first step is basically coming into each object, and we're going to assign seams to this. So you can see that these ones are done with modifiers. So to apply seams, I usually just use the hard ops process of just applying seams to stuff. And you'll see that this now has some seams where we would expect them to be. And then I'm just going to hit unwrap. And so the other thing that's also helpful is in the display options, you can also turn on stretch if you want to see your UV stretches as well. If it's going to have some weird distortion, it will display in the UV stretch, but we'll turn that off for now, and then we can go through that later. But yeah, so now we can see that this is looking pretty good. I'm also in the view menu, I'm just going to turn the clip plane up a bit so I can zoom in on these smaller objects without it clipping. So that would be the first one. And then when I'm done with the UV, I'll just move it off to the side here so that we can actually work with our next piece. So once we've done that one, we're going to move over to the next object here. So again, same process. We're just going to sharpen this guy. That looks like it's doing some stuff with actually applying some smoothing to that as well. So I just want to make sure that this isn't messing with my existing smoothing. And we're just going to bring that smoothing back there. But you can see now that we have some seams, and we're just going to unwrap again. Let's check out our UV seams there. And if we've got a really long piece like this where it's potentially going to take up quite a lot of UV space, I'll sometimes try and find a place that would make sense to put a UV seam in here. So we could potentially add one in here, and we'll just mark that seam and then we'll select everything and unwrap it again. So you can see that this is nicely laying out these objects. And then we just basically repeat this process on every object here. So for cylinders, this can be a little trickier. We'll do the same process, and you'll see that we'll just sharpen everything again, and we'll UV unwrap it. You'll see that some areas, so if we turn on our display for, let's make this window a little bit larger. For stretching, this can be good for identifying where some of these are going to look a little bit odd. And if you're having trouble visualizing this, one of the things you can do here is you can jump into UV Sync to see the differences here. So one quirk that's a bit weird with Blender is they have this option up on the left hand side called UV Sync. So when you're working, you'll see that we don't see any UVs as I mentioned before. When you select all of them, you'll see your UVs in the window here as we start to edit them. UV Sync is a workflow where you'll always see your UVs, it doesn't matter what you have selected. So that's something to keep in mind. It makes visualizing the selection a lot easier, because if we do this and we have everything selected, you can't tell what you have selected in the viewport. So if you turn on UV Sync, it's going to help you to understand which part of the model you have selected. Just be aware that UV Sync doesn't have a bunch of tools available, so sometimes you have to switch between the different view modes there, but just a bit of a quirk there for Blender. So now I've marked the seams on this cylinder. I'm going to unwrap this, but you'll see that some areas have a little bit of weirdness, like this area here isn't a particularly good UV seam for a cylinder, so I would mostly come in, and where we've got flat faces like this, we're going to be pretty good. If we've got edges like this kind of stuff, and you can see the difference between these areas with the UV stretching as well. Depending which type of stretching you have, you'll be able to spot these a little bit easier. So with these kind of guys, I basically will just add in seams for these. So we'll just do a mark seam here and a mark seam here, and probably also here. And then now let's just unwrap this, and you'll see that we can straighten out all those different sections there. So this is definitely looking a lot better. So you go through that kind of process there to fix up those areas, and then we just continue again. So for this one, let's have a look at how this is going to look. So this is actually mirrored, so we can do one side and then mirror the UVs there. So this is how those are looking. And if we didn't want a seam in the middle of this object, we could just basically collapse our mirror and then re-UV this. So if we do that there, you'll see that we now have these pieces, and this is how this is all coming together and looking for the UV. So just kind of continue along on this process. This one, we'll do maybe one of these other big pieces as well, just so we get an idea for that. So we'll mark our seam so on this guy, and these ones aren't really working, the seams aren't working super well on this area. So if you want to manually add seams, I will mostly use the select shortest path option, which is control clicking the edges, and you can actually come in here and manually add seams or remove seams. So that can be pretty handy. So we'll just come through and do that. Yeah, so that should give us some pretty good seams. And then what we can do now is just unwrap everything, and you'll see how this is coming together, which is looking pretty good, giving us some decent UVs there as well. So we basically just keep going through this process on every part of the objects, and just applying a sharpen to these, adding the UV seams to this, and then just repeating that process. I tend to just move them off. And then when I'm done with all of the objects, so let's just say we've finished with the UVs now, and we'll just hide some of these ones that we haven't UV'd here, and we'll just select the ones in here that we have UV'd. So these are all of our objects. Let's say we were kind of finished with our UVing here. We would basically select the different objects here in the outliner, and then we can tab in, and now we can see the UVs for everything. At this stage, we can definitely review any UV stretching that we have. If you wanted to check that type of stuff in the view mode, you can obviously come in here with the viewport here and check that, so you can see if you have any issues with stretching and everything. And then from there, we would begin our packing. So I'll cover that stuff in the next tutorial, but essentially what we would then do is start to pack our UVs within our UV space there, and that's how we're kind of approaching our UVs. So that's the process, and then you just repeat that process for every object in the leg. So we have all of these ones for the femur, and then we would repeat that for every other section in terms of the UVs there. So that's our process for UVing. So before moving on to packing our UV islands and actually starting to do our baking, I wanted to just briefly touch on how I would optimize the UVs and make sure that we're ready to pack and set the texel density and that kind of side of things. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to come over into the UV window, and you can see that when I've UV'd all of these objects, we'll turn off the UV sync here as well. So just let me disable that. Okay, so we've got all of our pieces here. They're all kind of unwrapped and everything and ready to go. One of the things I will generally do is try to, when I UV stuff, I'll try to offset it from the origin of the UV shell there, so that when I come to unwrapping these, they're not overlapping. Each one of these is kind of pushed somewhere randomly in UV space. So that's one note I would make. As far as deciding on the texel density, it's definitely helpful for bringing in a cube to sort of test the texel density, and I'll usually use the texel density checker. So if I was working with a 2K texture here and I wanted a texel density of say 1024 per meter with a 2K texture, I would click this 1024 button, and that's what resolution we're going to get. But obviously with our example, as I mentioned previously, we're not going to be working to a size based texel density. We're going to be mostly working on screen space. And so with the original screenshots, I basically decided to break this into 3 texture sets. So I'm just going to decide on an arbitrary value really that I use generally for the texel density. And so one of the ways I decided that is I set the cube up to 2048 per meter, which gives me, like, I know this is going to be a nice high resolution that I can use. And I tried to find a value for these guys which was going to basically match pretty closely to that. So the value I determined for these when I was working with this was around about 50 in the pixels per centimeter. And I just click set my texel density here. And that will just scale all of my UVs. And then what I would do is visually kind of compare, once this is finished generating the texel density for these, I can come in here and just visually check what resolution I've got compared to this object here. And having the text in here as well, if you sort of start to zoom through the model as well, we can enable the clip start here. Let's just do that. So you can sort of see that in here, we can see that the resolution is pretty good. Like on the letters and on the logos and everything, it doesn't look too low resolution. So that's what we're kind of aiming for, a decent texel density that kind of does that. So for the legs, I had a 2K texture and I managed to fit all of the stuff into that. Like for every single piece of the leg, I mean, not just for the femur, for all of the other pieces, I managed to fit that in one 2K texture. And then for the head and for the body, I did a 4K texture for each piece there. So just to keep it nice and high res, and I could definitely, if that was for a game, I could drop those resolutions down for sure. But in this case, for the portfolio, it's fine to use slightly higher resolution textures. Okay, so that's kind of how I decide on the texel density. And then I now just have to work on my packing. So for UV packing, I usually use the UV Pack Master. And this is a really nice add-on. It's definitely worth the cost of purchasing this one. So you can do packing in Blender in general just by packing in your UV. So you just come to UV here and you just select Pack Islands. This is the Blender like default packing. So you can pack your UV islands using that. But it isn't going to do a particularly great job. Like, it's definitely not too bad. So if you were packing without an add-on, I generally would probably just pack by hand. You're going to get a slightly better option there. But I tend to use UV Pack Master. This is really great. You just basically hit pack and it's going to pack the UV islands in there. There's loads of control in here as well. You can get it to do rotation and flipping. You can keep the scale fixed as well and things like that. And then if you use the heuristic search, This will just continue to pack until it finds the most optimal solution, which is really nice. So you just come in here and just run this until it packs the best option there. So that's really great. It will also pack into UDIMs and other things as well. So there's a lot of control within this UV pack master that you can use, and you can just see how we've kind of got that all set up there. This is just me packing the femur. Obviously, I would be working with the other pieces here as well, but you can see how I would bring all my UV shells in there. If I've got stuff that's symmetried or symmetrical, then I can enable the option for locking the overlap. So this one will basically make sure that if you've overlapped your UVs for things like symmetry, that it's going to stay in the place that it's placed. It's not going to try and repack them. So that's useful for symmetry and things like that. So that's the basics. I pretty much just use this and run the UV pack master, and it's going to pack everything into the UV shell. So for packing, it generally doesn't take very long. Most of the process for the low poly or lower detailed mesh and the UVs and everything is actually just optimizing and unwrapping. Once you've done that process, the packing is fairly straightforward. So that would be the process I would follow. And then now if we go back to our example here and we look at our final meshes, you can start to see that we can actually see these pieces. So when we look at the final beetle as well, we're going to see this is our unwrapped and modeled topology. So once we enable and turn this guy on, this will be the up-to-date geometry. So that's what we're kind of aiming for. We're trying to get to a place where these guys are being unwrapped and UV'd. So let's now kind of move ahead to actually how we would bake the data for these particular things to start texturing. Okay, so skipping ahead again a little bit here, we've now completed the UV pass on all of our objects. So we just select these guys and show the UVs here. So we'll get rid of the textures. So this is all of our UVs. They're all packed into the UV space, in the 0 to 1 UV space there. These are our objects. So one of the things I also just wanted to point out when I was doing this for real, when I was actually creating this, there's a couple of things I did. I did all my UVs in the same way as I showed in the class here. So we have them, the femur and the individual sections here. So I'm just going to turn this stuff off and show that. So here is the UV'd femur, and then we have the tibia and so on and so forth. So that's all the UVs for these parts. But what I then did was I placed these individually so that I could actually visualize everything together. And then I use this as an export. So basically have all of my objects here, and then I export this as my FBX. So just select the objects and export those. So I would just go to File and then Export FBX and then pick. In this case, like I have two exports. So we have an export here for the legs. So in this case, we're doing the legs, and then we also have this leg ID. So I'm going to show the reason that I have those. And when I'm exporting, I'm selecting selected object, and then I just turn off bake animation and anything else that I don't need, and then just export the UV'd version here, right? So that's fairly straightforward. The other one I have here is a duplicate. It's a clone of everything that I had before, like the low poly geometry. And then using that trick I mentioned before, where you can choose to override the material on an object level, I basically have an instance geometry of my low poly here with the materials applied. And the reason for that is because I want to bake an ID map. So in this case, we just have materials assigned to those different parts. And then I select these objects. And when I export these, we go over back to FBX. This is the leg ID that I'm exporting. Okay, so that's that particular portion and how we actually export out our individual parts here. So now over in Marmoset, this is where we're going to do our baking for the mesh data. So we're going to use this mesh data when we get into Substance Painter to do our texturing. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set up a baking project. And to do that, you click this new bake project icon here, which looks like a piece of toast. You just click that. And then we're going to drag in the FBXs we exported earlier. So the leg FBX will just drag and drop it in. And you'll see that we have this FBX, which is coming in here. And so for this one, we're going to bring this into the low poly part of the mesh. And then we're going to bring in our leg ID one, which had the materials assigned. So we can assign this over into our high here. And so for this, what we need to do is assign some, it's coming with the materials, but we need to assign some colors to these. So we're basically just going to put the red into the bronze, and then we can do green. Try to keep these just like RGB colors as much as you can. So we have green, and then we have this one, we'll make it red. So something like this. And then what we want to do when we do the rest of our model, so when we do the head and the body and everything, we're going to want to keep these colors consistent as well. So when we do our baking, we're going to assign smart materials and things later on. And we want our ID maps to basically be as consistent as possible so that when we apply materials, they're going to go into the same places. So you can see here that we have some basic colors applied to this based on the materials that we selected inside of Blender, right? So now we can hide the high poly and reveal the low poly again. You can do that as well in the bake project by just clicking these buttons that will basically show you the different versions. To do our baking, it's extremely straightforward. You want to choose a location. So in this case, we'll just choose a location here. So here is a folder. I'm going to give this a name. So we'll just call this Beetle Leg. And then from here, we can now choose to configure what maps we're actually going to bake. So in the case of this, we don't actually need a normal map. So we're not going to bake our normals. We're going to bake normals here, object space normals. We're going to bake a position, a curvature. We'll bake a thickness map, an ambient occlusion. We're going to turn off material ID map, and we're going to choose albedo instead. And so that's going to be, I think that's most of the ones. We might have to come back and tweak that, but we'll just, let's expand this a little bit here. So normals, curvature, thickness, ambient occlusion, base color there. So now what we would do is just set the size at which we bake. And if we wanted to choose any anti-aliasing options and things here, we can do that under these samples and the formats and everything. But then we can just hit bake basically. So if we hit bake on this, we're going to bake our different IDs and objects and everything. So once that's finished, it's going to be really straightforward to just preview that. So we can click this button here. That's going to show us what we've actually baked. So you can see here that we've baked that color map onto the object. This is what our ambient occlusion is looking like. And then as we go through the different ones here, you can see how this is looking. So these are the different maps that we would bake. So essentially we need to have all these different maps baked out. And then once we've done that, we're going to now set up our Substance Painter project so we can begin texturing. Okay, so here we are in Substance Painter. Now we're going to set up our project, and we're going to bring the leg in as an example. So we're going to go to File, New, and we're going to select our FBX. So we'll select the leg FBX from before, and then we'll just hit OK for now. And this is going to bring in that mesh that we worked with. So we can see that we have our leg in here. So to bring in the bakes, it's going to be really simple. We're just going to go to File, Import Resources. We're going to add resources. And then I'm just going to paste the path here of where I have my Substance Painter bakes. And so when we have all of this set up, we're just going to then choose all of these baked maps that we baked out from before. And then we're going to shift select these and set those to be textures. And then we're just going to import into the project. So this is going to bring in our ID maps and everything. For the texture sets, you can just come over into here and set those up. So in this case, we can bring our ID map into here. We'll bring our ambient occlusion in, curvature, position, that's actually normal world space, position, and our thickness. So that's all of our baked data. And if we press B, we'll be able to see that baked data coming through. So this has now got all the baked information. If we want to test our materials or test everything is going to work, I would definitely advise just putting a smart material on there, so we can grab one from the library and just assign a smart material to see that things are all working and we're getting the right textures coming through. So that should all be looking pretty good. And then the other thing you can also do is check the ID maps and things here as well. So if we were to just come in here with a smart material and we'll just hold control, and we can actually just bring in a few different smart materials here to actually test that the ID maps and everything are working how we want them to work. So at this stage, essentially all I'm interested in is that we have nice clean bakes. So I would usually go through all the different areas and I would just check the bake. So I'll come over to the ambient occlusion and make sure that there's nothing in there, no errors and everything. We go through and around the model and check issues with the AO. And then I would do the same with all the other maps. So most of them you don't need to, some of them you don't need to check. So for normals, we don't need to worry because we don't have a normals. World space, I don't usually check that one in great detail. That's usually okay. The ID map I definitely will check to make sure this is looking how I expect it to look. And then I will usually check the AO and the curvature as my main ones for checking errors. If I have any errors, you can usually spot them in those sections. And then as far as errors are concerned, some advice I would definitely give is making sure that you triangulate your models before you export. That's usually going to give you some pretty good results, because essentially for this particular tutorial, we shouldn't run into too many errors, because what we're baking the low poly onto itself. So the meshes aren't actually any different. So the bake shouldn't really cause us too many problems. So it's not like a high to low poly bake where we're having to make sure that things line up and whatever. It's generally pretty easy to make sure we don't run into errors there. So this is kind of what we want to aim towards, just getting our bakes and everything set up. For the basis of the class as well, obviously I'm covering in this tutorial, I'm just covering the leg section, but we can jump into the other parts as well as part of our recap and everything. So we'll go through that in the next video. Hey everyone, so in this session I just wanted to recap where we are in the class, and then I'll also set the homework assignment for this week. So in this particular part of the class, we basically recapped where we were up to so far as the modeling was concerned. We went over some basics about nanite guidelines and also the texel density and how to determine texel density in your project. We then set up our folder structure like we have done in previous classes to allow us to work on our low poly. We worked with collection instances again to set this up so that we can actually see all of the pieces at once. And then we optimized our geometry. So the first step in the lower density mesh or nanite mesh is to basically optimize the geometry and prep it in readiness for unwrapping and UVing. So we went through that process, how I generally will clean up my topology, make sure that everything is smoothing correctly, sort of applying modifiers and then prepping it in readiness for unwrapping. Then I actually covered the process of how to unwrap and pack the UVs. And then finally, we jumped over into Marmoset to do the baking and set up our project inside of Substance Painter. So for this week, my expectation for the homework assignment is that you'll get through this part of the process, especially for the leg. That's kind of the key part to understand the whole process. And then once you've done that, you can then apply that same process to the other parts. So here we can see, if I show that as well, so these are the legs. We go over to the head. This is broken down into a few more pieces, so we'll just turn that on. So here you can see this is the head, and we have also the tendrils and everything as well. So that's that one, and then we do the same for the body as well. So in the end of the class this week, ideally we would have a more finished model where we have everything sort of UV'd with our different texture sets and the bakes kind of finished as well. So this is where we want to get to in terms of this particular week. We want everything to be finished. The process for doing the head and the body is exactly the same as the leg, so I'm not going to cover that in the tutorial. It's just the same process, optimizing the geometry down, cleaning stuff up, unwrapping and UVing, and then packing the geometry and then baking. So exactly the same process for the head and for the body as it was for the legs. So yeah, so hopefully that makes sense, and I look forward to seeing your submissions.